Change is hard. We all know this. Every single one of us has tried to change something in our lives and struggled. Maybe it was trying to eat healthier. Maybe it was trying to be more patient with our kids. Maybe it was trying to transform the culture of our organization. And what happens? We start strong. We're motivated. We're excited. And then, slowly, we drift back to our old ways. The question is, why? Why is change so difficult? And more importantly, what can we do about it? Here's what most people get wrong about change. They think change is about willpower. They think change is about discipline. They think if they just try harder, if they just want it more, if they just push through the resistance, they'll succeed. But that's not how change works. That's not how human beings work. When we rely solely on willpower, we're setting ourselves up to fail. Because willpower is finite. It runs out. And when it runs out, we're right back where we started, often feeling worse than before because now we've failed again. The truth about creating lasting change is this. Change doesn't come from pushing harder. Change comes from understanding why we do what we do. It comes from understanding the systems and patterns that drive our behavior. It comes from working with human nature, not against it. When we understand this, when we truly understand how change happens, we can create transformation that actually lasts. Let me tell you something about the human brain. Our brains are designed to conserve energy. They're designed to create habits and patterns that allow us to function without having to think about every single action we take. This is a good thing. If you had to consciously think about how to brush your teeth every morning, how to drive your car, how to type on your keyboard, you'd be exhausted before lunch. Our brains automate behaviors so we can save our mental energy for more important things. The problem is, our brains don't distinguish between good habits and bad habits. They just create patterns based on what we do repeatedly. So when we try to change, we're not just fighting against our own lack of discipline. We're fighting against millions of years of evolution. We're fighting against neural pathways that have been reinforced thousands of times. We're fighting against a system that's designed to keep us doing exactly what we've always done. No wonder change feels so hard. No wonder most change efforts fail. We're using the wrong strategy. Here's what works instead. Instead of trying to force change through willpower, we need to design our environment to make the change easier. We need to reduce friction for the behaviors we want and increase friction for the behaviors we don't want. We need to make the right choice, the easy choice. This isn't about being weak. This is about being smart. This is about understanding that we are all products of our environment, and when we change our environment, we change ourselves. Let me give you an example. Let's say you want to exercise more. The traditional approach is to set a goal, get motivated, and then rely on willpower to get yourself to the gym every day. But what happens when you're tired? What happens when you have a rough day at work? What happens when it's cold outside and your bed is warm? Willpower fails every single time. But what if instead of relying on willpower, you changed your environment? What if you laid out your workout clothes the night before? What if you found a gym that was on your way home from work instead of out of the way? What if you made a commitment to a friend to meet you there? Suddenly, exercise becomes easier. You've removed friction. You've designed your environment to support the behavior you want. This principle applies to everything. If you want to eat healthier, don't keep junk food in your house. If you want to read more, put books everywhere and put your phone in another room. If you want to be more present with your family, create phone-free zones during dinner. Change your environment, change your behavior. It's that simple and that profound. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Change isn't just about individual behavior. Most of the changes we want to create involve other people. We want to change the culture of our organization. We want to change how our team communicates. We want to change how our family interacts. And when we're trying to create change that involves other people, we face a whole new set of challenges. Because now we're not just dealing with our own habits and patterns, we're dealing with everyone else's too. This is where most leaders get it wrong. They think that creating change is about making announcements. They think it's about sending emails and giving presentations. They think if they just explain the change clearly enough, if they just make a compelling enough case, people will follow. But that's not how it works. People don't resist change because they don't understand it. People resist change because change is scary. Change is uncertain. Change threatens their sense of safety and belonging. Think about it from their perspective. When you announce a change, what you're really saying is everything you've been doing up until now isn't good enough anymore. You're saying the skills and knowledge that made you successful in the past may not make you successful in the future. You're saying, I need you to step outside your comfort zone and try something new, something you might not be good at yet. Of course people resist. They're not being difficult. They're being human. So how do we create change when it involves other people? We start with empathy. We start by understanding that resistance isn't the enemy. Resistance is information. When people resist change, they're telling us something important. Maybe they're scared. Maybe they don't have the skills they need. Maybe they don't trust that the change will actually make things better. Maybe they've seen too many change initiatives fail in the past and they're protecting themselves from disappointment. Our job as leaders isn't to overcome resistance. Our job is to understand it and address it. This means we have to slow down. I know that sounds counterintuitive. When we want to create change, we want to move fast. We want to see results. But rushing change is the fastest way to fail, because lasting change requires trust, and trust takes time. Before people will change their behavior, they need to feel safe. They need to believe that it's okay to make mistakes as they learn. They need to believe that you're committed to supporting them through the transition. They need to believe that this change is about making things better for everyone, not just hitting some arbitrary target. This is why the most successful change efforts start small. They don't try to transform everything at once. They identify one specific behavior or practice to change, and they focus all their energy there. They get a small group of people on board first, the early adopters who are excited about the change. They experiment and learn together. They celebrate small wins. And then, slowly, the change starts to spread. Other people see it working. Other people see their colleagues thriving, and they want to be part of it too. There's something powerful that happens when change is voluntary rather than forced. When people choose to change because they see the value, because they see their peers succeeding, because they want to be part of something better, that change sticks. But when change is mandated from above, when it's forced on people without their input or buy-in, you get compliance at best and sabotage at worst. You might get people to go through the motions, but you won't get real transformation. This is where leaders often struggle. They want to be decisive. They want to show that they're taking action. They want to demonstrate that they're in control. So they make big, bold pronouncements about sweeping changes. And then they wonder why nothing actually changes. Because real change doesn't come from pronouncements. Real change comes from relationships. It comes from sitting down with people one-on-one and listening to their concerns. It comes from involving them in designing the solution. It comes from giving them ownership over the process. Let me tell you what this looks like in practice. Instead of announcing a new initiative and expecting everyone to fall in line, you start with questions. You ask people what's working and what's not. You ask them what they need to be successful. You ask them what they're afraid of. And then you listen. Really listen. Not just waiting for your turn to talk, but genuinely trying to understand their perspective. And here's what happens when you do this. People feel heard. People feel valued. And when people feel heard and valued, they're much more willing to try something new. But listening isn't enough. You also have to act on what you hear. This doesn't mean you have to do everything everyone suggests, but it does mean you have to acknowledge their input and explain your thinking. When people understand why certain decisions are being made, even if they don't agree with every detail, they're much more likely to support the overall direction. Transparency builds trust, and trust is the foundation of change. Now, let's talk about something that makes change even harder: our relationship with failure. We live in a culture that punishes failure. From the time we're kids in school, we learn that mistakes are bad. We learn to avoid failure at all costs. We learn to play it safe. And this creates a huge problem when we're trying to create change, because change requires experimentation. Change requires trying new things. And when you try new things, you're going to fail sometimes. That's not a bug. That's a feature. Failure is how we learn. Failure is how we grow. But if people are afraid to fail, they won't try anything new. They'll stick with what's safe and familiar, even if it's not working. So if we want to create real change, we have to change our relationship with failure. We have to create environments where it's safe to experiment, where it's safe to admit when something isn't working, where failure is seen as data, not as a personal deficiency. The best leaders understand this. They don't punish people for trying something new and failing. They ask questions. What did you learn? What would you do differently next time? How can we apply this lesson going forward? They create a culture where failure in the service of learning is not just accepted but celebrated, because that's how innovation happens. That's how improvement happens. That's how change happens. This requires vulnerability from leaders too. You can't ask your team to take risks if you're not willing to take risks yourself. You can't ask them to admit their mistakes if you never admit yours. You have to model the behavior you want to see. You have to be willing to say, I don't have all the answers. I made a mistake. I need your help. When leaders are vulnerable, when they're human, it gives everyone else permission to be human too. And that's when real change becomes possible. Let's talk about another critical element of creating change: clarity of purpose. People need to understand why the change matters. Not just what they're supposed to do differently, but why it matters. What's the bigger purpose? What are we working toward? How does this change connect to something meaningful? Here's the thing about human beings: we're meaning-making creatures. We need to feel like what we're doing matters. We need to feel like we're contributing to something bigger than ourselves. When we understand the why behind the change, when we can see how it connects to a larger purpose, we're willing to endure the discomfort that change requires. But when we're just told what to do without understanding why, it feels arbitrary. It feels like change for the sake of change, and that's when resistance kicks in. This is why starting with why is so important. Before you tell people what needs to change or how to change it, help them understand why it matters. What problem are we solving? Who are we helping? What becomes possible when we make this change? When people can connect the change to something they care about, when they can see how it aligns with their own values and goals, they become champions for the change rather than obstacles to it. But here's where it gets tricky. The why has to be genuine. It has to be true. You can't just manufacture some inspiring purpose to manipulate people into doing what you want. People can smell inauthenticity a mile away. The why has to come from a real belief that this change will make things better. It has to come from genuine care for the people involved and the mission you're serving together. And the why can't just be about profit or efficiency or meeting some metric. Those things might be important, but they're not inspiring. They don't touch people's hearts. If the only reason you can give for why change matters is it'll help us hit our quarterly numbers, don't be surprised when people aren't excited about it. But if you can connect that change to how it helps you better serve your customers, how it creates better opportunities for your team, how it allows you to make a bigger difference in the world, now you're speaking to something deeper. Now you're giving people a reason to care. Let me share something else about creating change that doesn't get talked about enough: the importance of patience and persistence. We live in a world of instant gratification. We're used to getting what we want immediately. Order something online, it arrives tomorrow. Send a message, get a reply in seconds. But change doesn't work that way. Real, meaningful change takes time. It takes consistency. It takes showing up day after day, even when you don't see immediate results. This is hard for us. We want to see progress. We want to know that our efforts are making a difference. And when we don't see quick results, we get discouraged. We start to doubt whether the change is worth it. We're tempted to give up or move on to the next thing. But this is exactly when persistence matters most. Think about how habits form. Research shows it takes anywhere from a few weeks to several months for a new behavior to become automatic. That's for individual habits. For organizational change, for culture change, we're talking years, not months. The changes we want to create often require shifting patterns that have been in place for decades. That doesn't happen overnight. The most successful change makers understand this. They don't expect overnight transformation. They measure progress in small steps. They celebrate incremental improvements. They understand that sustainable change is like compound interest. The daily actions might seem small and insignificant, but over time, they add up to something significant. A 1% improvement every day doubles your effectiveness in less than a year, but you have to stick with it. You have to trust the process even when you can't see the results yet. This is also why it's so important to build in regular reflection and adjustment. Change isn't a straight line. It's not a matter of setting a plan and executing it perfectly. It's a process of constant learning and adaptation. You try something, you see what works and what doesn't, and you adjust. You gather feedback, you reflect on what you're learning, and you refine your approach. This requires humility. It requires being willing to admit when something isn't working and change course. Too many leaders get attached to their original plan. They've invested so much in developing the strategy, in selling it to stakeholders, that they can't admit when it needs to change. Their ego gets in the way of effectiveness. But the best leaders hold their plans loosely. They're committed to the outcome, but flexible about the path. They create regular opportunities to pause, reflect, and adjust. They ask their teams what's working and what's not, and they're willing to pivot when necessary. Now let's talk about the role of community in creating change. One of the most powerful forces for change is social influence. We are profoundly affected by the people around us. We adopt the behaviors and beliefs of our peer group, often without even realizing it. If everyone around you exercises regularly, you're much more likely to exercise. If everyone around you reads, you're much more likely to read. We are social creatures, and we look to others to understand what's normal and acceptable. This has huge implications for how we create change. If you want to change behavior in an organization, you can't just focus on individuals. You have to focus on the culture, on the shared norms and expectations of the group. You have to create a critical mass of people who embody the new behavior. Once enough people are doing it, once it becomes the norm, everyone else will follow. This is why peer-to-peer influence is so much more powerful than top-down mandates. When people see their colleagues succeeding with a new approach, when they see people they respect and admire adopting a new behavior, they're much more likely to try it themselves. It's social proof. It's the power of example. And it's far more effective than any memo or presentation could ever be. So if you want to create change, identify the influencers in your organization. Not necessarily the people with the highest titles, but the people others look to and respect. Get them on board first. Support them. Give them what they need to succeed. And then let them spread the change through their networks. Let them tell the story of how this change has helped them. Let them model the behavior for others. This organic, grassroots approach to change is slower than a top-down mandate, but it's much more likely to stick. Another crucial aspect of creating lasting change is making sure the systems and structures support the behavior you want. You can't expect people to change their behavior if the systems they work within are designed for the old way of doing things. If you want people to collaborate more but you only reward individual performance, they're not going to collaborate. If you want people to innovate but you punish every failure, they're not going to take risks. Your systems have to align with your values. This means looking at everything. Your hiring practices, your promotion criteria, your performance reviews, your reward systems, your meeting structures, your decision-making processes. All of these things send powerful messages about what really matters in your organization. And if those messages contradict the change you're trying to create, the change won't happen. Let me give you an example. Let's say you want to create a culture of learning and development. You talk about it all the time. You tell people how important it is to keep growing and learning. But then when it comes time for promotions, you only promote people based on their current performance, not on their learning and growth. What message does that send? It sends the message that learning is nice, but performance is what really matters. And guess what people will focus on? Performance, not learning. If you really want to create a culture of learning, you have to build it into your systems. Maybe you give people time during work hours to pursue learning opportunities. Maybe you make learning and development goals part of everyone's performance review. Maybe you create opportunities for people to share what they're learning with their colleagues. Maybe you celebrate people who take on stretch assignments, even if they struggle at first. You make learning visible, valued, and rewarded. That's when it becomes part of your culture. The same principle applies to any change you want to create. Look at your systems and structures. Ask yourself, do these support or undermine the change we're trying to create? And then be willing to change those systems, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it challenges the status quo. Because if your systems and your stated values are out of alignment, your systems will win every time. Let's talk about the emotional side of change. Change isn't just a rational process, it's deeply emotional. When we're going through change, we experience a whole range of emotions: fear, anxiety, excitement, hope, frustration, confusion. And these emotions are valid. They're not obstacles to overcome. They're part of the process. Too often, leaders try to ignore the emotional aspect of change. They focus on the practical details, the timelines, the metrics, and they wonder why people aren't on board. But you can't separate the emotional from the practical. If people are scared or anxious, no amount of logic and reason will convince them to embrace the change. You have to address the emotion first. This means acknowledging that change is hard. It means giving people space to express their concerns and fears. It means validating their feelings instead of dismissing them. When someone says they're worried about a change, the worst thing you can do is say, "Don't worry, it'll be fine." That doesn't help. Instead, ask them what specifically they're worried about. Listen to their concerns. Help them think through what they can do to address those concerns. Show them that their feelings matter, that they're not alone in feeling uncertain. At the same time, help people connect with the positive emotions that can come with change. Change can be exciting. Change can be energizing. Change can be an opportunity for growth. When we're only focused on what we're losing or what we're afraid of, we miss the possibilities. Help people see what they're gaining, not just what they're giving up. Help them see how this change could make their lives better, their work more meaningful, their impact greater. This is where storytelling becomes powerful. Don't just talk about change in abstract terms. Tell stories of real people who've gone through similar changes and come out better on the other side. Tell stories of what becomes possible when we push through our fear and try something new. Stories connect with us emotionally in a way that data and logic never can. They help us see ourselves in the narrative. They give us hope and courage. Here's another truth about creating change. It requires sacrifice. Change means giving something up. Maybe it's comfort. Maybe it's certainty. Maybe it's old ways of working that we're attached to. Maybe it's even letting go of parts of our identity that no longer serve us. And sacrifice is hard. We don't like giving things up. We hold on to what's familiar, even when it's not serving us anymore. This is why change requires conscious choice. We have to decide that what we're moving toward is worth more than what we're leaving behind. We have to decide that the future we're creating is worth the discomfort of the transition. And this isn't a one-time decision. It's a decision we have to make over and over again, every day, sometimes multiple times a day. As leaders, we have to help people make this choice. We have to help them understand what they're sacrificing and why it's worth it. We have to be honest about the challenges while also painting a compelling vision of the future. We have to give them reasons to hope, reasons to believe that the struggle is worth it. And we have to be willing to make sacrifices ourselves. We can't ask others to change if we're not willing to change. We can't ask them to give something up if we're not giving anything up ourselves. Leadership is about going first. It's about modeling the change we want to see. It's about demonstrating through our actions that we're all in this together. Let me share something about maintaining change once you've created it. This is where so many change efforts fail. The initial push happens, people get excited, new behaviors start to emerge. And then, slowly, things drift back to the way they were. Why? Because we don't build in the structures to sustain the change. We treat change as a project with a beginning and an end, rather than as an ongoing process. Sustaining change requires constant attention and reinforcement. It requires keeping the why alive. It requires celebrating progress and addressing setbacks. It requires making the new way of doing things so embedded in your systems and culture that it becomes the new normal. This takes time. This takes consistency. This takes leadership that doesn't move on to the next shiny object, but stays committed to seeing the change through. One of the most effective ways to sustain change is through rituals and routines. When new behaviors become ritualized, when they become part of the regular rhythm of how we work, they stick. Maybe it's a weekly team check-in where you review progress on your change initiative. Maybe it's a monthly celebration of wins. Maybe it's a quarterly reflection on what's working and what needs to adjust. These regular touch points keep the change alive. They keep it visible. They keep people accountable. It's also important to keep connecting the change back to outcomes. Help people see how the new way of doing things is making a difference. Share stories of success. Share data that shows improvement. Help people connect their daily efforts to tangible results. When people can see that their hard work is paying off, when they can see that the change is actually making things better, they're motivated to keep going. Let's talk about something that's often overlooked in discussions of change: the importance of rest and recovery. Change is exhausting. It requires constant mental and emotional energy. It requires being uncomfortable. It requires learning new things and unlearning old patterns. And if we push too hard for too long, we burn out. We can't sustain the effort. This means building in time for rest and recovery. It means recognizing when people are getting overwhelmed and pulling back. It means celebrating progress and allowing people to consolidate their gains before pushing forward again. Change isn't a sprint. It's not even a marathon. It's more like a series of sprints with rest periods in between. The best leaders understand this rhythm. They push when it's time to push, but they also know when to ease off. They pay attention to the energy levels of their team. They watch for signs of burnout or resistance, and they adjust accordingly. They understand that sustainable change requires taking care of the people doing the changing. Now, let me talk about something that requires courage: the willingness to let go of what's not working. Sometimes, despite our best efforts, a change initiative isn't working. Maybe we've misdiagnosed the problem. Maybe the timing isn't right. Maybe we don't have the resources we need. Whatever the reason, the change isn't taking hold. And we have a choice. We can keep pushing, investing more time and energy into something that isn't working, or we can admit it's not working and change course. This takes tremendous courage. It's hard to admit when something isn't working, especially when you've invested a lot in it. There's ego involved. There's the fear of looking like you failed. There's the sunk cost fallacy that makes us want to keep going just because we've already invested so much. But the most effective leaders are willing to cut their losses. They're willing to admit when something isn't working and pivot. They're willing to learn from the failure and try a different approach. This doesn't mean giving up at the first sign of difficulty. Remember, change is hard and takes time, but it does mean being honest with yourself about whether you're seeing any progress at all. It means being willing to ask hard questions. Is this actually moving us in the right direction? Are we solving the right problem? Is this the right approach? And it means being willing to act on the answers, even when it's uncomfortable. Here's something else that's critical for creating change: celebrating progress along the way. Change is a long journey, and if we only celebrate when we reach the final destination, we'll lose momentum and motivation long before we get there. We need to celebrate the small wins. We need to acknowledge progress even when it feels incremental. Celebration does something powerful. It reinforces the behavior we want. It gives people a sense of accomplishment and progress. It builds positive momentum. It reminds us why we're doing this hard work. And it creates positive emotions that fuel our continued effort. This doesn't mean throwing a party every time someone does something right. It can be as simple as acknowledging someone's effort in a team meeting. It can be sending a quick message of appreciation. It can be taking a moment to reflect on how far you've come. The key is to make it regular and genuine. When people feel seen and appreciated for their efforts, they're more willing to keep trying. Let me share one more critical insight about creating change. It starts with you. You can't create change in your organization, in your team, in your family, or in the world if you're not willing to change yourself. You have to be the change you want to see. You have to model the behavior. You have to walk the talk. This is harder than it sounds. It's easy to see what needs to change in others. It's much harder to see what needs to change in ourselves. But if we want to be effective agents of change, we have to start with self-awareness. We have to be willing to look honestly at our own behaviors and patterns. We have to be willing to admit where we're falling short. We have to be willing to do the hard work of changing ourselves first. And here's what happens when you do this. You gain credibility. People see that you're serious about this change. They see that you're not just asking them to do something you're not willing to do yourself. They see that you're human, that you're struggling with the same challenges they are, and that makes them more willing to trust you and follow your lead. Change is possible. Real, meaningful, lasting change is possible, but it doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't happen because we wish for it or because we try harder. It happens when we understand how change actually works and when we're willing to do what it takes to create it. It happens when we design our environments to support the behavior we want. It happens when we build trust and create psychological safety. It happens when we start small and build momentum. It happens when we're clear about why the change matters. It happens when we're patient and persistent. It happens when we leverage the power of community and social influence. It happens when we align our systems with our values. It happens when we address the emotional aspects of change. It happens when we're willing to sacrifice and make hard choices. It happens when we sustain our efforts over time. It happens when we celebrate progress. And it happens when we're willing to change ourselves first. This is how change is created. Not through force or mandates. Not through willpower alone, but through understanding human nature and working with it rather than against it. Through building trust and creating the conditions where change can take root and grow. Through leading with empathy and purpose. Through showing up day after day with commitment and courage. The world needs people who are willing to create change. Not just talk about it, but actually do the hard work of making it happen. People who are willing to start where they are, with what they have. People who are willing to be patient and persistent. People who are willing to lead by example. People who believe that things can be better and are willing to do what it takes to make them better. You can be that person. You already have everything you need. You just have to start. Start small. Start today. Start with yourself. And trust that if you keep going, if you stay committed, if you follow these principles, you will create change. Real change, meaningful change, lasting change. The kind of change that makes a difference. The kind of change that matters. The kind of change that leaves things better than you found them. And that's what it's all about.